Namaste. So we have gathered for a very special event, as we know, 150th birth anniversary of Sri Aurobindo. And the best way to celebrate is to stay quiet and receptive in his presence, to invoke his presence through Savitri, through his writings, through an inner aspiration, through a call, through surrender, through devotion and faith. And of course, when we think about him, when we read about him, when we speak about him, when we reflect and meditate upon his life, these are the ways by which we can open to the special help that comes on these occasions. So, for these 3 days, what came to me very naturally and spontaneously is that we can look at human life. We have reached here through thousands of years of aspiration, if not hundreds of lives, this point. And as a human being, we can say that there are three types of human beings who aspire or who have reached a certain point of development. And I am not speaking here of the majority whose life is centered around eating, drinking, be merry, have progeny, and that's all. But an awakened humanity. So there are three layers of this kind of awakened humanity who do different kinds of work for God in the world. One is that they preserve the past or bring out all that is beautiful in it so that it can be integrated with the future. And we see a whole lot of humanity in the last 1,000 years or maybe 2,000 years where there was a tendency to preserve the past, to bring out the past. Whole of India's history has been like that. The Vedas were given by the rishis and then the Upanishads, then the Gita, but there is a whole section of humanity whose task is to faithfully preserve the text and from time to time bring out its real meaning. Because if we just preserve it faithfully, then again the meaning is left to each one's interpretation, which anyways is one of the things that human beings engage into. But at the same time, it's important to keep reintegrating this past with the present circumstances. So this is one kind of work where the past is brought out and made contextual and relevant to these circumstances. And religions which fail to do it, which remain stuck and glued to the past, just as it was, they stop advancing. And whatever stops advancing over a period of time decays and dies. And this, I believe, is one of the strengths of Sanatana Dharma, that it has always allowed a relook at the past, and thereby reinvent itself. It integrates itself with the present, and that's what we see over a period of time. There are different ways people have looked at the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Gita, and had their own experiences according to the age in which they lived. And that's something very beautiful. The original writings are there. Anyone can always go back to it. But at the same time, there is a way to re-look and reinvent ourselves in the light of a past knowledge. This one kind of humanity, and which is engaged in it to link up the past with the evolutionary momentum of the present. There is second kind of action, second kind of works, which is in which mainly those who can be called as the vibhutis they engage in, and that is they bring change in the present. So they usher changes of various kinds: social reform, political changes, intellectual revolutions, scientific advancements, and so on and so forth. And these are also necessary because, as we know in Indian thought, Dharma is not just something static. It has that aspect also, that stable basis of all things, but Dharma is also evolving, the evolving field of evolving Dharma, and that is something very beautiful about Sanatana Dharma. There is not stuck to a rule book of black and white. It recognizes shades of grey through which humanity moves, and as it moves, even in one lifetime, and depending upon different types of humanity, different situations, contexts, there is an evolving dharma. In other words, all that helps us to grow towards a better future. So there is a whole layer of humanity that brings in changes, ushers changes, which make us grow towards the future. Of course, not all changes toward the future. There are changes which can be retrogressive. There are changes which undermine the future, they become fashions. But here we are focusing on that layer of humanity which has an evolutionary impetus, which embody the evolutionary energy and usher in changes. And we see that also, especially in the last 400, 500 years, from the intellectual interpretation of the Vedas by Swami Dayanand. Then we have Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Brahmo Samaj, and Keshav Chandra Sen, and many others who started, Sri Ramakrishna Paramahans, and of course Swami Vivekananda, and many others who actually they took up the past and gave it a new evolutionary impetus and evolutionary possibility. Particularly we see in the life of Sri Ramakrishna this opening of a door towards a greater synthesis of the different religions through which humanity has moved up till this point. And then of course there is a third type of humanity. At least it wears a human form, but as Sri Aurobindo says in Savitri, it's a translucent mask which covers the all-wise that guides the world. They represent not just some change, but they represent a radical leap of human consciousness from whatever it is to a far distant future. They build a bridge and they set humanity moving along those pathways in the trails they have gone, and then over a period of time, maybe few centuries, humanity starts arriving somewhere near that. Beautifully summarized in Savitri, this was a seed sown in endless time. A light is shown, a word is spoken, and a light is shown. These ages toil to express. So, the ages toil to express. So, we see this kind of humanity is the avatar where there is the divine himself. He steps into the forefront of the human quest and leads the human march, Lok Sangraharth, through a narrow gorge, through a door of crisis towards a greater and greater becoming. So in Sri Aurobindo's life, we see very beautifully all these three simultaneously together. And these 3 days, maybe we can take up each aspect, and on the grand culminating 15th August, we speak about Sri Aurobindo, the avatar. But today, just how Sri Aurobindo has worked upon the past. So all these 3 strands of action, or we can say Sri Aurobindo's Karmadhara, we can see. One is where he brings out the past, but all the beauty and glory of the past which is lying buried in a mass of a body of words, of course, and a mass of understanding, misunderstanding, dust of centuries, and he brings it out and he gives it a new meaning, a new sense, which could be useful for the future. That is the whole purpose. So when he says in the very beginning, for example, when he speaks about the Gita, he says, well, we have to take that aspect from the Gita which is yet humanity needs for the future. And of course he says there is much in the Gita that is always useful for the future. So he speaks about 2 kinds of things in the past, scriptures, things which are temporal and things which are eternal. So in Indian thought we see that there are much that is eternal, but a classic example of temporal and eternal would be in the Vedic ritual of sacrifice. So we see that Vedic rishis would light up a fire and they would throw the samhita, and through that they would seek rain, they would seek a change of season, they would make the earth fertile. Now this has its validity, and it probably still has its validity and had its validity in those days. It was another kind of technology, if you may say so. But today, the more important aspect of the Veda is not that Karma Kand, but the Gyan Kand, the aspect of the Vedas which is eternal, the one self expressing himself in many forms. So this is how we see in the Gita itself, very beautifully, Shri Krishna draws the distinction between Vedvad and the true Vedic knowledge, the Vedantic truths. So we see that there are temporal aspects of a scripture which are which can be left aside. They were useful at a given point of time. One classic example with regard to Sri Aurobindo, when he speaks about the past, particularly in foundations of Indian culture and the synthesis of yoga and the Gita, he speaks about the Chaturvarna, the fourfold order of society, which unfortunately is mistaken or deliberately, I would say, people speak about it as caste system in India. But to start with, it was not jati but varna. It was not based on birth but temperament. So this was a fourfold order based on the four layers through which humanity advances from where it is to where it can go. So, in its early stages of evolution, humanity is more centered around the physical. So, when it is centered around the physical, that is its world, and it's normally, the everyday experiences that come through the senses. That is its life. Then the next layer comes where it wants to go beyond this immediate physical context, physical touches, physical sights, physical hearing, physical understanding of things into a larger, it sails through an ocean towards larger and larger shores. It engages into a larger interchange with the world. A world which it does not yet see, but it explores as an adventurer, as a mariner, as the modern businessman who takes his goods beyond the the typical example is in villages. There used to be the Mela, where they were the tribals who would make their little nice handmade things, pottery and all. They would come and sell it. This was their limit. But later on, the same thing expanded into such beautiful piece of pottery and different things made by artisans, but carried across the world. So this was the second layer of humanity. And the third layer of humanity, which had the impulse towards truth and justice and right, towards strength and power, and a fourth layer which was towards knowledge and wisdom. And yes, once all these layers human beings had crossed, they could look up toward the beyond, towards something which goes off beyond all the four varnas. So those who took to spiritual life had none of these varnas. It was said that sadhu ki, sant ki koi jaat nahi hoti. Now, when in the Indian context, this was very relevant, because Indian thought, Sanatan Dharma, believes in rebirth, and the whole idea of rebirth is an evolutionary process. But when we look at it from the Western lens, which doesn't believe in rebirth, it believes only in one particular life. So it becomes all meaningless. It appears as if, there is a differentiation which is being created. So Sri Aurobindo, we see, brings out this, and he also says that, well, it has been broken, and rightly so, because instead of temperament over a period of time, it became a question of birth. It lost its real sense. And even with regard to birth in the beginning, because Indians understood what heredity really means, and later on it was lost, and therefore, it had to be broken aside, and something greater had to come for the future. And perhaps it is to typify this, that the old system is broken. You see, very interesting, in the Gita, it is Sri Krishna who establishes this. He says that I am the one who has established these Chaturvan. Now, very interesting that Sri Aurobindo is born in a family which actually, in a sense, doesn't really believe in all these things. And he himself, if you look at the hierarchy of things, he doesn't belong to any higher caste, higher varna. But he has come to typify that all these things have been broken aside, and yet he releases that truth. Because those truths remain. Humanity moves through different layers. Doesn't matter what we call them, or we don't give it any term, but it is going to be moved towards that. Similarly, we see Sri Aurobindo bringing out the truths of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And how beautifully, when he speaks about Rama, there are letters of Dilip Kumar Roy where he says, well, how can we really call Rama an avatar? And he raises his injunctions based on, Michael Madhusudan Dutt's questions. And then he reveals that we have to see the Rama in the context of the setting and the time as has been given by Valmiki, and in its totality. You can't pick up isolated incidents and start arguing about Rama's life. And then beautifully, there is a very beautiful letter written to Dilip Kumar Roy on what Rama represents and how he is the avatar. And he says, I see no one else who would fit in except Rama. Then when he speaks about Krishna, he gives us a new meaning of what we today call as the Krishna Lila, where we read, and the gopis, for instance, Vastra Haran, so beautifully he says that when God came and plucked my robe of vice, I let it go. But when he came to pluck my robe of virtue, I hesitated. So this is how he speaks even about, how those who are mystics, they will understand the meaning in a different way, and those who are living in the gross passions, they would understand it in a very different way. So we see that the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Gita, now the Gita we'll see that is strewn with words like integrals, even he would use the word about supermind. Now, in the Gita itself, directly we don't see a reference, but Sri Aurobindo brings out. In fact, before Sri Aurobindo's what he has revealed about the Gita was generally regarded as a Shastra of Karma Yoga. Of course, there is in it the integral yoga, but most people would regard it as a gospel of action. And yes, it is a gospel of action, but the beauty is this action is intertwined with bhakti, intertwined with jnana. It's not just a gospel of works, it's the triple path, as Sri Aurobindo says. So when he speaks about the Gita, he speaks about those moments also when Shri Krishna almost opens the doors to the supermind, then knowing that humanity is not ready, he shuts it back. So we see again, he brings out that in the Gita, which is going to yet liberate humanity. Mother in fact spoke about it, that with the new interpretation given by Sri Aurobindo, the action of Gita has become manifold and it is going to yet liberate humanity in times to come. Similarly, with regard to the Vedas. So Vedas were one of the books in which humanity started re-engaging. I was hearing someone say that, the first humanity, it was the Western context in which people started getting interested in the Veda, particularly quoting Max Muller. I want to say that it's not really true. The Vedas have always engaged people in the Indian setting. The great Shankaracharya, Madhavacharya, Ramanuj, all of them engaged with the Veda. And then we see Dayanand Saraswati. So Max Muller, in the Western context, yes, we see that one of the first persons who started engaging with the Vedas is Max Muller. But it's not true that that's how the revival started. But for some reason or the other, we see people started engaging with the Veda, but invariably the interpretations were either one-sided, the Karma Kand was completely taken off, the stress on the Gyan Kand or the Vedanta, which created a one-sided understanding of the Veda, the Vedanta eventually leading to an otherworldliness, because, it speaks so much about meditation and jnana. So also we see that there is that element of bhakti which is there as a seed. The Sam Ved is all about that, but that goes missing in the subsequent interpretations. And then of course there is a problem of words, because the Vedic mystics wrote their speech always had at least two layers of meaning. And the first which was very much with the images of all that they saw, all that they felt, all that they understood of cows and horses and carts, the Ravaka and the cart story, and fruits and flowers, and these are the images they used of rivers or mountains, because these were the images in which they lived, and through these images they conveyed a profound truth. Why they chose to conceal it? Because they believed in Adhikar Bhed that these profound truths should not be given to anyone and everyone. And one can understand why, because knowledge is a tremendous power. They understood the power of knowledge. Knowledge is empowerment. And if these things fall into the wrong hands, they can be very dangerous. So we have stories in the Puranas where there are people who there is an Asura who actually swallows the Veda, hides it under water. So all this we begin to understand when we read what Sri Aurobindo has spoken about it. And when Sri Aurobindo interprets the secret of the Vedas, it is something which opens a new door of understanding. At least that was my feeling, having read the Vedas, as a child growing up in a typically religious atmosphere. I just went through it. It honestly made no sense. It was a good interpretation, but it made no sense at all. Then Swami Dayanand Saraswati again made little bit sense, but not what one is really looking for. That why is it being regarded as such a wonderful and high scripture? The Upanishads, again, Gandhiji's and Radhakrishnan's Upanishadic translations and commentaries, but they didn't make sense. You're looking for something which is missing. But the moment one of the first books that came across in my hands was Secret of the Vedas, along with the synthesis. And I still remember just reading the first few pages, and I had such a aha experience that here is it. This is what one is looking for. So these are wonderful works where Sri Aurobindo brings out the past. This is one kind of action which he engaged in, where he took up the past but gave it a totally new understanding and a new direction for the future. But when we use the word new, we must understand that Sri Aurobindo was not doing it on the basis of just interpretation. He was very much aware that they are words and sounds, and he was completely in sync with the philology of those times. And as we know that when Sri Aurobindo came to Pondicherry, Sri Krishna gave him a new Nirukta. So this was what changed the whole thing, etymology of words, the grammar which was used in ancient times, which was lost, and based on that and his own experiences. So he could reinterpret the Veda in a new light completely. There is a line in Savitri, an archivist of the symbols of the beyond. So when he started revealing, then one understood. Even today we see many people when they speak about the Vedas and they speak about the holy cow, they still take cow to be the physical animal, which is okay, which is good, nothing wrong with that. Cow is a wonderful animal, and I believe that no animal should be killed. Animals are such beautiful, they trust us actually, they trust us so blindly, almost like little children. And to make them meat, to kill them and use it for pleasure, it's not something very beautiful. Not only cow, and definitely all higher mammals, animals subtly carry in them some kind of a consciousness which where they look up to us as beings like gods. They need to evolve along our lines, and then to suddenly break their trust and to just take it for the sake of palate is certainly not a good thing. But having said that, the cow, the holy cow in the Vedas, just imagine the cow of plenty. Aditi, Mother Aditi, she is described as a cow. Kamadhenu in the heavens of Indra, and of course we know that with Vasisht Rishi, where she can bring out of her feet, by simply moving her feet, she can bring out armies which can defeat an entire army of Vishwamitra. Surely they are not speaking of a physical cow. And Sri Aurobindo reveals to us how from the root Go, which is all about light. So Go, Gupt, Gopal, all of them, Gop, Gopi, all of these words refer to the root Go, which means light. And from there we also have the word Guru. So Guru also can be seen in this way. Go is light. So, Go was light, and the rishis were aspiring for the light of plenty, for the increase of light. So when we read Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the Vedas, now it's a whole vast subject. We discover not just the Vedas, I must say, but why it is contextual. As I said, this discovery has to be contextual. We discover the Vedas and we understand ourselves. That's what the Vedic knowledge is meant to give us. It's not meant to give us what people were doing in ancient times and how they were, bringing cows and offspring. So when we read about offsprings, the rishis are asking. It was so evident to me when I read Sri Aurobindo's interpretation that the offspring are the new energies of the new consciousness which are born in us as a result of engaging in the Vedic yoga. So the more we ascend to higher levels of consciousness, there are new energies which come in. And that's what we see is typified in the story of Savitri and Satyavan, where she asks for offsprings which come as a result of the joining of Savitri and Satyavan. And these offspring, wherever, sometimes we read about 60,000 offsprings of King Sagar, which seems an impossibility. And obviously 60,000 offsprings who have lost their way, and again they take the cow or the horse and they tie it in Patal, are evidently offsprings. Such plenty of offsprings are generally those which belong to the subconscious regions, these energies which have sprung up. So a whole new understanding, though Sri Aurobindo touches upon Purana several places, not all the legends, but a whole new understanding begins to emerge. For instance, in Bande Matram, then he touches on the Puranas. He speaks about the story of Dakshi Prajapati. So in that story he says that, the goat's head is fixed behind. Now, we all have read the story, but as to put it in context, when we speak about new creation, now what do we really mean? Of course, there is a certain, and we speak about resurgence of the past, what really do we mean? Is it the form or the spirit? So repeatedly Sri Aurobindo speaks about that it is the spirit that has to be brought out, and it will receive new forms, because new forms are needed for the new manifestation. The spirit is not something static, it evolves. So we see, Vedic literature over a period of time, though they are the classical four Vedas in the Sanskrit, but there are also others and others which have come. And Sri Aurobindo, based on pure philology, for instance, when he speaks about Vyasa, Mahabharata, how beautifully he says what could be added and what is not added, based on the way the slokas run. So when he speaks about them, he is not just speaking as an interpreter. Interpreter is interpreting a body of words based on, present day understanding, based on present day knowledge of the grammar. But when Sri Aurobindo is interpreting it, he is completely basing it on philology exactly as it is. So we see many interpretations of for instance, Isha Upanishad, and the classic example is where Sri Aurobindo speaks about Shankaracharya, where there have been even tweaking of verses to give it a spin which would give us the idea of otherworldliness. So this is a very important work which we need to engage in. Otherwise, all the time we hear from so-called authorities which give an interpretation which is otherworldly. And in all this bringing out, whether it be Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Puranas, the Vedas, and of course the Upanishad, Sri Aurobindo reveals to us that Indian thought, Indian way of life was never otherworldly. In fact, if you read it, you feel it never was. It allowed for a otherworldliness in those rare individuals who wanted to cut off from all this, worldly engagements, who wanted to take up sannyas in the sense of physical. But that was not the predominant strain. But if you read, I'll give another example, Kena Upanishad. When you read the typical commentary, it gives a feeling that this is not the world that you need to really be in. The real world is elsewhere. But when Sri Aurobindo interprets it, reveals it purely on the same meaning, he says, no, there is a deeper sense behind it, and there is this ordinary world, there is this greater world of the gods, and there is the still greater world which is yet to manifest, the unmanifest, who comes as eternal, and even the gods don't know him. So there are new possibilities. See, this story of the gods who don't know the eternal is something very interesting. So these gods have come, but they have won a victory in man, which means they've created an idealized humanity. And then when you understand the entire overmind creation which the mother had brought and then she demolished, one can understand in the light of Kena Upanishad. The gods had won. They had created an idealized humanity with ideal impulses, ideal thought, ideal feelings. And yet that victory is not enough. They would rest content and there would be a decline. So the eternal comes to reveal to them that there are still greater things hiding in the unmanifest. So they must be humble enough to recognize that this victory is not the last and final victory. So, and then, even this question about how is such a person of help to society. So Sri Aurobindo brings out that last bit in the Kena Upanishad where he says, he becomes like a flower to which bees are attracted. And then he speaks about, the honey, he becomes full of rasa. And such a person draws many others very naturally. He doesn't have to do anything simply because he is full of that delight and ecstasy of the divine. Now, when we understand, like at least that was my experience, that then a whole new world opened. Before that, when I had read the Kena Upanishad, it seemed, well, it is otherworldly. Ultimately, it is saying this world, these senses, we are living in a world which is so limited, so ignorant. And there is something else higher towards which we must aspire, especially those lines where it says, Yan mansana manute yenahur manomatang tadeva brahmantvam vidhi nedam yadidam upasate. But then it became very clear that, well, these are the steps and stages of our ascension, and there are still beautiful things which are to come, which are hinted in the Kena Upanishad, more revealed in the Isha Upanishad, and completely brought to the forefront by Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of all these works, and of course his other works. So this is how he speaks about the Upanishad. Then he speaks about Indian culture. Those who don't, who have all kinds of misgivings about Indian culture. There are two writings. One is the Bangla writings, and the second is Foundations of Indian Culture. So in Foundations of Indian Culture, which started as a rejoinder to a critic, but actually goes much farther to reveal, when you read through Sri Aurobindo's eyes, he is lending us his eyes. So often when I look at Sri Aurobindo's works, I really feel that toward the end of, what we can call as the earthly embodiment, we see that Sri Aurobindo had almost lost his eyes. When I read this, I was deeply touched that here is someone who gave us sight, and to give us sight, he lost his eyes, almost lost his eyes. But he would recognize people by the contact of consciousness. That's what Amal Kiran writes, that how he would recognize when last darshan Amal Kiran came and Sri Aurobindo turns to the mother and speaks about Amalkiran, because purely by contact of consciousness, the sight behind the sight he could recognize. But here is somebody who wrote extensively and lost his sight to give us new sight and a true sight. And the least we can do as a homage, as an expression of gratitude in the year that is going to come, is to read Sri Aurobindo, because it contains his new sight. It is his eyes. So often when we read Sri Aurobindo's works, we can understand that Sri Aurobindo is lending us not just his word. There is the word which new creates us. See the power of the word to create anew. So they are spandan, they are vibrations. And when we read his words, it creates us anew and states of consciousness which are not accessible to us. But it is also Sri Aurobindo's ears and eyes that he is lending to us. The Vedic rishis had truth audition and truth vision, and that he is lending to us. So he is literally engaging in a kind of sacrifice where his vision, where his ears, hearing, all this inspiration and everything, he is giving us as a means towards, so that we can see with his eyes, we can hear with his ears. It's so beautiful. I always feel when mother, sees Sri Aurobindo, and how beautifully she says that it matters not that there are thousands of beings plunged in ignorance. He whom I saw yesterday is here on earth. So what is mother doing? It is not just a prayer. She knows we are blind. So she is lending her eyes to us who are blind, so that we can see the world with her eyes. So when we read the foundations of Indian culture, the image of India that comes before us. Otherwise, before that, there is all this, talk about that, no, Indian culture was all otherworldly, and they are just showing fantastic things, Pushpak Viman, and all this arrows, this weaponry, all this, whether it existed or not. Now, Sri Aurobindo, without touching that aspect, whether Pushpak Viman existed or not is not the issue, but there was such a developed civilization, and he bases it not just on an emotional sentiment. He bases it on actual temple constructions, bases it on music of ancient times, poetry of ancient times. Particularly, he brings in also Kalidas along with Vyas and Valmiki. So, on all that available literature, he bases and reveals to us what truly is the greatness of India. And it's so important because, see, we don't hang in a vacuum. One of the big problems that has happened today is that our Indian youth are completely disconnected with the past. Why? Because of the left liberal thought and the typical thought which has streamed in from the Western world, that and of course the communist world, that all these are just imaginations. There was never any Hanuman, the monkeys don't speak, and many such things which have streamed in. There was a whole serial based on Ramayana. It was based on Nehru's book Discovery of India. Not just Ramayana, it was Discovery of India, Bharat Ek Khoj. But it had completely different leanings altogether. You could see that it is not showing India, it is rather demolishing India in a different way altogether. So in times as these, when we see all kinds of forces are working, and as we know that it is the 75th year of also of India's independence, Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, the least we can do is engage with this beautiful book. It's not a difficult book to read. It doesn't have so many pages, and it has enough to engage us for a lifetime. But this is a wonderful book to just read together, because then we understand what really India is, because that's the foundation on which we have to build. It gives us a new understanding of Sanatan Dharma. Sanatan Dharma was not about ritual. Sanatan Dharma was not about otherworldliness. It allowed many things. But it is something much vaster, much more powerful, much more comprehensive. It was engaging with light. When you read Sri Aurobindo, he says that Indians had stupendous vitality. That's why they were creators. They created so much and so many things. And to remind ourselves of that is important. We have that story in Ramayana where Hanuman is sitting on the seashore and he says, "How can I cross the sea? I am just an ordinary monkey." And that's when Jambant, reminds him that you are not an ordinary monkey. You are Rama's monkey, and you have done such beautiful feats in the past, and you can do even greater in the future. So the reason why we should remember and remind ourselves is so that our baseline is good. Then again we see that another word which we find very often, Arya Varth. This is how, and there was at one point of time even a newspaper by the name Aryavarth. So it was about that land of India as it existed in ancient times, and what was the Aryan ideal. So of course we know that his writings themselves, the name of the journal was Arya. And he, naturally, people questioned that, are you trying to take us to an archaic past, and are you being racist, and, Aryan, Dravidian, all these theories that come. So Sri Aurobindo was the, one of the first ones. Of course, Swami Vivekananda also debunked the Aryan theory, Aryan invasion theory, not the Aryan theory, Aryan invasion theory. There were others whose voices were suppressed, but Swami Vivekananda very powerfully debunked. But Swami Vivekananda did not write a whole, reasons why he's debunking it. Sri Aurobindo debunked the theory on philology, on anthropology, on his own contact with his, when he came down south with the counterparts, his own understanding. You see, he went to the details of analyzing the roots of Tamil and Sanskrit and Latin, and showed us the commonalities. In fact, he says Latin is like a bridge between Tamil and Sanskrit. There are so many similarities. One can actually see how that little bit of changeover takes place. So his work on debunking the Aryan invasion is something which I don't think there have been many now. Fortunately, we have the archaeological evidence of the lost river Saraswati, and several books have been written. But still I feel that what Sri Aurobindo has written, debunking the Aryan invasion theory based on his study of philology, is something which is unparalleled and unmatched. So, he was, by this way, he was also trying to bring India once again become a unifying force for India. Because one of the problems for India, even today, is this divisive politics. Everywhere we try to divide based on, various ways. But Sri Aurobindo reveals that these kind of so-called, what we call as divisions, were not divisions. They were richness of Indian culture and thought which allowed variety. But yet all this variety was based on one common seed truth, that is Sanatan Dharma. And that's why you see the reason why this South-North divide and all this came up. I'm not going to name the person because that belongs to the realm of politics. Somebody who said, well, South of India is a very different country altogether, because they couldn't understand culture. That person couldn't understand culture and religion. Whereas actually if you see that North and South, East and West, you can understand only on the basis of religion and culture. You may have different tongues and different things, although tongue also, as I said, Sanskrit and Tamil. And you see from North to South, from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, it's Shiva. You see from West to East, you see it's Krishna. Dwarka and Manipur, it's something very strange that it is culture which has connected India. It's religion which has connected India. And if you remove that force, you will see nothing but, United States of India, always striving for disunity. So all this is a work which is so important, where many things from the past he took out and revealed to them in a new light. That light Sri Aurobindo had brought, with which he saw them, was not a light of the mind. He was not interpreting it based on reason and based on his philological understanding alone. But there was a greater light. So very often when we read these things from Sri Aurobindo, we see a whole new India emerge on the world scene. A strong India, a powerful India. An India which once in her pristine glory rightfully commanded the whole world, but always it commanded not for him itself, but for the greater good of the world. There is something very beautiful that Sri Aurobindo mentioned, with which we can probably, pause, and if there are any questions over the next 10 minutes, we can take up. Because today we are just touching upon the past aspect. Sri Aurobindo says, when he gives that Uttar Para speech, I think this is a speech which every Indian should read. I'm not saying with the idea of proselytizing anyone. There is nothing like that in this yoga. But everybody should read this speech, because this is a speech which reveals to us what really is meant by the rise of India. So while India should advance technologically, scientifically, industrially, in everything, Sri Aurobindo was very much progressive in every area. But its base is Sanatan Dharma. It is the guru of the world. Its key is spirituality. Spirituality is the master key of the Indian mind. So there are few things which Indian mind or Indian thought cannot do away with. And one of them is dharma, the other is adhyatma. Adhyatma literally means spirituality, means ascension of consciousness, adhyatma. So yajna, the understanding of life is a yajna, not an outer yajna, but that life belongs to all. This sense is innate, inbuilt in Indian thought and Indian culture and Indian practice. So dharma, yajna, adhyatma, yoga, all these we need to revisit in Sri Aurobindo's light. The synthesis of yoga, he very beautifully, he says that this world as we see today presents a cauldron of media. Media is the Greek, sorceress. Now I must say, in the passing, before I touch upon this, that when he is digging out India's past, he is also bringing out the past of other civilizations. We are suddenly enter into Celtic and the Druids, the world of the Druids, the Slavs, all of them suddenly appear before our eyes. Greeks particularly, you suddenly see Egyptian. He brings them all alive. They are no more just dead past, but as if they continue to exist in one form or the other, and they are yet determining the future of mankind. If we understand what Sri Aurobindo has spoken about, the past civilizations, we will much better understand the present, including the conflicts that are going on in the world. For instance, why Akhand Bharat? Because they have always been one. You can't divide what is one. You try doing it, they will join together. So this is how, he brings out all these things. And there in synthesis he says, the world presents itself as a cauldron of media, where all that was there in the past, which was yet useful, is being shredded into pieces and cast into the vessel. For what? Making a nice khichdi. So, of course, we are good at making khichdi, but there are two kinds of khichdi. One is where we casually just pick up everything and put it. Other is that even in khichdi there is an art. So now we talk about wideness, but there are two types of wideness. The wideness of the sea and the wideness of the sky. Sea has depth in it, but it stops at a point of time. This depth goes toward darker and darker layers. It has a rich life. But the vastness of the sky is something very different. It is also living and teeming with countless luminous planets. Who knows how many types of life exist on that? Its vastness is endless. Its depth is beyond measure. So, when he speaks about that, he says, among these things from the past, Indian yoga is one of those things. He wrote this in 1916-14. In fact, Synthesis of Yoga, very first page. That Indian yoga is one of them which still will be brought out into the forefront for the good of the humanity. But then he says something very remarkable. But first, it must rediscover itself. It must step out of the ascetic caves and rediscover itself. And I think that the rediscovery began when in 2014 or 15, I am forgetting which year, that there is an International Yoga Day. But yet, still, as Indians, we should not use the word yoga for asanas. Yoga is something much more profound. Just like Dharma is not religion, we should stop looking at India through the eyes which we have received from another civilization and culture, which is okay. Everybody has a right to look at things like that. But India should be looked from the eyes of India. And what better eyes of India than of Sri Aurobindo? So this is about the past. Maybe tomorrow when we meet, I'll speak about Sri Aurobindo's work with the present as a vibhuti. Sri Krishna speaks about being a vibhuti and an avatar. And on 15th, we'll speak about the avataric aspect of Sri Aurobindo. Namaste.